Hello, everybody, and welcome to tonight's webinar. My name is Carrie Lyons, and I am the Education and Outreach Director here at the Minnesota State Horticultural Society. I'm here tonight with Jen Ellehert. Sorry if I said Ellehert, Vice President of Metro Bloom's Design and Build. Jen has a bachelor's degree in plant science and sustainable agriculture from Cornell University and a master's of landscape architecture from North Carolina State University. Jen leads the design team at Metro Bloom's Design and Build, ensuring that equity principles are incorporated throughout company culture and projects. And just a few housekeeping items before we begin. You are attending the webinar in listen-only mode, so you will be able to hear our presenter, but we can't hear you. If you have questions for our presenter, you can type those in on the questions panel on the right side of your screen. We'll be covering questions at the end of the presentation. And if you don't see the panel, look for an orange arrow in your screen's upper right corner. Click on that arrow and it will pop out the panel. And now I will hand things over to Jen. Thanks, Jen.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I appreciate being here tonight. Thanks everybody for joining us on kind of a rainy evening. I would like to thank the Minnesota State Horticultural Society for inviting me here tonight to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is usually plants, but also plants and pollinators in this case. I'm excited to be with you this evening and to tell you a little bit more about the work that we do at Metro Blooms. So tonight we're going to talk about planning and planting and installing your own pollinator or pocket pollinator garden. I think it's great that pocket pollinator gardens and pollinators in general have become really popular. It's something that a lot of gardeners are thinking about. I'm hearing a lot more about that in publications on gardening, looking to support pollinators. And we're going to talk tonight about kind of all the details that you need to support pollinators, not just picking the right plants for the right place, but also how you're maintaining that landscape. What you're doing in the off season to help ensure that your plantings are surviving, doing well, and then doing the best that you can and creating the best habitat to support pollinators. So as we get into that, the first thing I would like to tell you a little bit about is Metro Blooms. So Metro Blooms is a nonprofit organization. We've been around for about 30 years. Our focus is really, and I'll read you our mission here, is to partner with communities to create resilient landscapes that foster clean watersheds, embracing the values of equity and inclusion to solve environmental challenges. We really rely on our community partners to work and create community pollinator habitat. You'll see in this presentation a lot of the pollinator templates that I'll be sharing were created through our community programs and our community projects. I work for Metro Bloom's Design Build. We are a for-profit organization that is wholly owned by Metro Blooms. And our work goes to support the mission of Metro Blooms. And then also we have our educational wing, which is Blue Thumb. I'll be telling you a little bit more about Blue Thumb at the end of the presentation. Blue Thumb really is a great resource for a lot of information statewide about pollinator plantings, resilient landscaping, and I'll give you some links to that as we go through the presentation tonight. All right, so as we get started, one of the things that's really important to me to talk a little bit about is why are we here talking about pollinators? Why are we planting for pollinators, and why is that really important? Well, it's really important because wildlife and plants have evolved over a long period of time to support each other. And so the very kind of small, nuanced work that we do in our landscape can have a big impact on creating habitat or not creating habitat. So we're going to talk a little bit tonight about what that means and how you can create that habitat. Native plants, of course, are uniquely positioned to provide the right nutrition to pollinators. That means a native plant is generally a plant that is not considered a cultivar. If you see a plant that has a name behind it, so it might have purple coneflower, but it's called Kim's Knee High, that is a cultivar of a coneflower, and that means that it has been sort of bred a little bit to be a little shorter, a little bit more compact. It's a great plant, but it may not be providing the best resources to support pollinators. So by planting native plants specifically, you're doing the best for pollinators. And we'll talk a little bit about that, and I'll show you some of our recommended native plants in the planting templates later on in the presentation. Also, it's really important not just to plant new pollinator habitat, but then to manage it correctly for pollinators. So we're going to talk a lot about fall maintenance. This is the perfect time of year to give this presentation, to also think about what we're doing in our gardens now that may or may not impact pollinators. So I just think that's really important. If you are interested in supporting pollinators with your landscape, kind of thinking about the why behind why you're doing that is also really important and will help kind of change how you interact with your landscape and how you maintain it. Okay, so some fun facts about native plants and pollinators. Food and habitat is really important for pollinators, and they really need very specific plants. So a lot of our native pollinators are specialists. That means they are dependent on specific nutrition provided by native plants. So that specific nectar and pollen, that could be a flower shape that a insect has evolved to feed from that specific flower. So these very specialized relationships. And those specialized relationships mean that those native plants are going to be providing the best benefit for pollinators. Also, it's really important to think about our birds. I think we all engage with birds. We love hearing bird song. One of the things we don't really think about is that all of those caterpillars, all of those pollinators do a lot to support our native birds and provide them with not only the native plants are not only providing nuts and berries, but also quite a bit of high protein from the pollinators in order to support our bird habitat. And that's really important. I know we all really enjoy hearing birds, seeing birds are an important part of our ecosystems. All right, just a little bit about one of the reasons that pollinator habitat and why we're creating pollinator habitat is so important right now. So there are some conservation challenges that our native pollinators, our native birds are experiencing, and that comes from habitat loss. This is a fairly striking image. I like to think it shows historic prairie coverage before 1900. That's what's in the yellow. In 2012, when this map was made, it showed current prairie coverage as of 2012. And those little tiny red dots had to be enlarged a little bit so that you could see them enough on this image. So we can see that habitat loss has really impacted our state. And that habitat loss is somewhat critical in that we now have that much less habitat to support pollinators. So there's less diversity, less native habitat standing. So that's about 98% of the historic prairie in Minnesota. Now, what's been causing that habitat loss and that conservation challenge? Of course, we've changed the way our land looks. So human development has resulted in the loss of plant coverage, not only in how many plants are available, but in that biodiversity of plantings. Of course, we need agricultural land to grow crops, to grow our food. That's very important, but it does reduce biodiversity. And any urban and suburban development does as well. So when you zoom into kind of the top right, that's the 7-county metro area. Those purple areas are the remaining high quality habitat. And usually that exists around lakes, around creeks and rivers, and you can see how that also has been reduced. So we have this opportunity now to create patches of pollinator habitat. We created this map on the left as we were installing kind of small pollinator projects throughout the city of Minneapolis. This is the city of Minneapolis border. And all of these green patches are, little pocket pollinator plantings. And so every insect has a radius that it can fly. And so if you put like a 400-meter radius around some of these plantings, you start to see them interconnect. And you can see how by creating a small patch of pollinator habitat, you're really adding to this larger kind of matrix and patchwork of habitat throughout our city and throughout our counties and our state. And so this image is meant to help, illustrate how your pocket planting can have a really big impact on pollinators, even though it might seem really small right now. When you consider it as part of a bigger picture and lots of other pollinator habitat, it's great. It's really helpful. So it's not just planting for pollinators that is important. It's also what you do with that planting and how you manage it. And some of the things that are really important if you are going to be planting habitat is protection from pesticides. That's what our pollinators need in order to be able to survive and thrive in this new planting that you're creating. It's important to source your plants from nurseries that do not use insecticides and pesticides or other chemicals. You can check a lot of our very responsive and responsible native plant nurseries in our area. Do not use these chemicals. It never hurts to ask so that you know that you're sourcing your plants from a clean source, and so that those plants are going to provide the best food source. Pollinators also need clean water. I don't think we always think of that. So clean water sources can be nearby, water bodies. That can also be providing a water source in your yard, in the form of a bird bath, in the form of a small dish with some rocks and pebbles that you refresh the water in it all the time. You do have to refresh that water. Of course, we have a lot of mosquitoes here in Minneapolis and Minnesota in general. So keeping that water clean will help reduce any mosquito habitat. The other thing that pollinators need are food resources throughout the season. So we have our, kind of mid-April to right about now, we really need blooming plants all throughout that growing season. So if you plant something that just has a plant that blooms in July, it's beautiful and that's wonderful, but you're really not supporting pollinators when they emerge in April, all through when they they hibernate in November. So providing staggered bloom times and food sources that are blooming throughout the season is really important. Excuse me. Another thing that's important is nesting sites. We have a variety of pollinators in the state, and some nest in standing vegetation, so they're stem nesters, and some are ground nesting pollinators. So you can always provide a little bit of bare ground. Excuse me. I'm gonna have some tea here. If you have your tea, this is a great time to take a sip as we are going through our presentation this evening. And ground nesting pollinators do want to have a little bit of bare ground to be able to have access. Generally in the sunlight is really nice to have access to that ground to be able to nest in it. Also, standing vegetation. So we're going to talk a little bit later about maintenance and how you maintain your landscape. Leaving standing dead vegetation is a good practice. It's actually really nice in the fall. You can just relax, enjoy the beautiful leaves. There's not as much to do right now. And I'm going to tell you kind of a bit of the why behind how we want to change how we maintain our pollinator habitat. And then finally, what that's doing is creating this sort of network of habitat and protected refuge for pollinators so that they can travel from patch to patch to patch, as you can see in this map here. All right, I just want to provide a little bit of a quick spotlight about two pollinators that I think in general are very engaging and that in our state are very popular. Folks know a lot about them and are interested in supporting them by providing habitat. Of course, the monarch butterfly, which is a very charismatic species. A lot of people interact with it and are very familiar with the monarch. The monarch needs milkweed. So it needs milkweed as a host species. There are a number of different milkweeds that grow in our state, many of which are excellent for the monarch butterfly, and they can grow in a variety of conditions. But it also needs nectar species. So I think that's one thing that we don't always think about, is that someone might say, gosh, I have a lot of milkweed, but I'm not really seeing any monarchs in my garden. Well, you need to provide nectar species to be able to attract them. That nectar species right next to the milkweed provides the habitat that they need. Blooming native nectar species include meadow blazing star, that's often called the monarch magnet. You'll see a ton of monarchs on those. It is Liatris ligulus stylus. It's listed here. Joe Pyeweed is another great monarch attractor. Purple coneflower, our native purple coneflower, all great species to attract monarchs. And they really need that connected, high-quality habitat that's protected from pesticides. Just really a fun species to talk about, one that I think really fun for kids to see in a garden if you're trying to engage your family and your community in creating habitat for pollinators. By creating habitat that includes species for monarchs, I think you'll find that it's a very engaging, exciting experience. And one that you may be a little bit less familiar with includes the rusty patch bumblebee. The rusty patch bumblebee is an endangered species, and it is our state bee. There have been quite a bit of interest in it more lately. Our state has a program called Lawns to Legumes. It is providing grants to support pollinator habitat to help put in habitat suitable for the rusty patch bumblebee. And I'll tell you a little bit more later about where you can go to find out about that. The rusty patch bumblebee is a generalist species. So it is a little bit less specific than, for example, the monarch butterfly. It is active from April through October in our area, and it needs that high quality forage throughout the season. So kind of back to what I was saying a few minutes ago, really needs staggered bloom times all throughout the growing season to be able to have enough forage in an area to support itself. It is a ground nesting species, so a little bit of protected bare soil is what it needs for nesting. And again, connected high quality habitat. Okay, we'll talk a little bit now about site selection. I get a lot of questions about site selection. I hear a lot of folks will say, I only have shade, I really can't support pollinators. And that's just not true. We have a lot of really great shade templates, some of which I'll show you later, to help kind of get you learning more and more about native species that can grow in the shade and that can support pollinators. You know, we are putting in native habitat in all kinds of sites. It's obviously really important to know your sun conditions. That can be your first thing you're thinking about when you're trying to pick a little area of your yard for your pollinator patch. Is it sunny or is it shady? And one thing I would say is that it doesn't have to be exclusive from the rest of your landscape. So you can have existing landscape, you can have some existing foundation plantings, but what you're really interested in is putting pollinator habitat in front of them. Great. That's fine. It doesn't have to, you don't have to have sort of typical landscaping in one part of your yard and then your pollinator areas over here. You can really start to integrate that in a very beautiful and aesthetic way throughout your yard. So while we're talking about creating pollinator patches here today, if you don't have the ability to create a whole new landscape bed, you can just start to incorporate some of these plants into your existing landscaping. Now I show a couple of examples here. The one on the left is a really urban area. It's right in a shopping center. This is a planting that we were on the pots. Carrie, I think your microphone may need to be muted. There we go. And you can see the plantings in the pots here. And we're getting ready to plant a pollinator planting in a few separate patches, because this particular location is very interested in supporting habitat in their landscaping around their business, which is fantastic. And then you can see on the right, here's just a pretty small area, a foundation planting around a back patio that is plenty of space to provide habitat. So starting with your site selection, what you're really thinking of is, okay, am I going to be taking out turf? You know, where am I going to put this new planting, and come up with a bit of a plan so that you don't just impulse buy pollinator plants, so that you're actually planning it out a little bit and then you're picking the right plants for the right place. Okay, site preparation. This is often the toughest part of starting any new landscaping project, is kind of the more difficult work of preparing the area. We're going to talk a little bit about a few ways that you can do that. Ultimately, each of these methods really depends on you, what your resources are, what your physical needs or physical abilities are, and things like that. So often I get a lot of questions about removing turf. Folks are interested in mowing less. They want to be able to have more flowers, and they want to remove some turf in order to be able to install pollinator plantings. You can do that a couple of different ways. You can put down cardboard, as you see on the left. Some folks call this the lasagna method, and that can include putting down cardboard, some soil, compost, and then mulch on top. And you can actually just leave that for a while, for a season even, to kill the turf underneath it. Of course, there's solarizing that can be done with clear and black plastic. So here, this strip of turf, by solarizing it, it gets really hot underneath that plastic, and it's one way to kill the turf off. More often than not, because we are working sometimes with the Conservation Corps, who's featured in our photo here, and also with our crew, we will often use a sod kicker. This is maybe more of the physical side of things, so this takes a little bit more work to do, but it's pretty easy to use this tool that you see on the right. They can often be rented at a local Ready Rents, for example, to be able to just strip the layer of turf off the yard. If that's turf that you want to use somewhere else, great. If it comes up nice, you can roll it up and reuse it somewhere else. One thing I would say, though, is that a lot of people ask if they can just flip the turf over so that the soil side is up and then leave it and plant into that. I generally don't recommend that because I find that the turf will reroot and really grow again, and that can be really a maintenance challenge. I do recommend that if you are establishing a new planting, you do remove the turf. You don't plant into turf because I think that can be difficult to maintain later on. In terms of site preparation, if your soil is either heavy in clay or heavy in sand, you may want to add some organic matter. That organic matter can be in the form of compost. You can certainly purchase compost. If you are purchasing compost, I generally recommend to purchase a plant-based or like a mushroom-based compost, not a manure-based compost. Manure-based compost is generally very high in nitrogen, and it's almost a little more nitrogen than these plants necessarily need. Manure-based compost, because it is so high in nitrogen, if your planting is an area where it might run off or water flows over it and then it would run off, that additional nitrogen is not often being taken up by the plants, but it's kind of being washed off and contributing to water quality issues. So really organic matter that is more balanced is a better compost to purchase. Also leaves. So this is a time of year when a lot of leaves are coming down. We'll talk about leaves in a moment, but if you have an area of additional leaves where you can add those to your soil, you can certainly mow them with a bagging mower and then be able to apply them to your landscape. I love this picture of this gentleman sweeping chopped leaves into the wild ginger. I think it's fantastic. You want to uncompact the soil as well, but you don't want to till it. So tillers tend to pulverize soil and pulverize it to the point where any of our existing soil mycorrhizae that live in the soil no longer are in big chunks. So if you take your shovel and just simply loosen the soil, you can flip the soil over and take a rake and rake it smooth. That's enough because that leaves big chunks of soil mycorrhizae and soil fungi together. Tilling it pulverizes it to the point where those soil microorganisms have to work a lot harder to come back. So don't till, but do decompact your soil. Of course, clean up after yourself. One thing you don't want to do is to get a lot of sediment and soil on your sidewalk or in your street. That can go down our storm drain and contribute to poor water quality. So make sure that you're sweeping up any additional soil or sediment. And then we do recommend mulching new plantings. This doesn't mean that you have to mulch this planting year after year after year, but what it does mean is that some type of shredded or double shredded mulch or cedar mulch, as you see in the picture on the bottom right, really helps to hold the moisture in and then reduce weed pressure. So as you're getting these new native plants established, that mulch is going to help provide like a good environment for them to get going. And we've had a couple of really hot, dry summers. And so that first layer of mulch, about 2 inches, really helps to hold some moisture in the soil. We'll talk a little bit more about that again in this presentation. And then a little bit about planting style. If some of these plants are plants that you are not necessarily familiar with, one thing I would really recommend is to plant them in groupings. Not only does this provide a lot of kind of visual impact, so you get a nice, really big stand of wild bergamot like you see here on the bottom, but it also helps you identify these plants a little bit better. So next year, the plants are coming up, or the year after you plant them, and you think, gosh, I can't really remember what this is. And these are new to me, I can't really identify it, but you see they're in a really regular pattern. You go, okay, I think even though that plant tag has blown away, I think this is the wild bergamot I planted. And that really helps you maintain your landscape later by planting in groups of 3, 5, or 7. And that's kind of a residential scale for a pocket planting, which is of course what we're talking about here today. So that'll help you maintain them year after year. And then if you see this one plant coming up, doesn't really look like the rest, it's not really in a regular pattern, well, that's likely to be a weed. So it really helps you with maintain your garden down the road. So that's one of the reasons we recommend kind of planting in groupings for that visual impact. And then of course you're providing a lot of forage for pollinators. So by doing so, you're also providing big groupings of blooms to provide that forage throughout the season. And if you have planned your garden and staggered the bloom times, then you can provide that staggered bloom throughout the season. All right, a little bit about plant selection. Just in terms of plant sizing. So I think it is fun fun to buy 1 gallon plants, bigger plants that give you kind of more of a visual impact quickly, which I certainly understand. But you can purchase a lot of native plants in smaller containers. Small containers can be like a 4-inch or a 2-inch container. They're easy to plant, so if planting itself is physically difficult, smaller containers are going to be easier. They also grow really quickly. They root really well. And I think in our really hot summers, they have a little bit less transplant shock. So where I've seen some bigger 1 gallon pots that may be a little bit root bound, those are kind of struggling in some of our hot, dry summers. Of course, you're providing supplemental water, but still some of these smaller plants seem to adapt more quickly and really get established. I would say it's pretty important to lay out all your plants before planting. So I'll be sharing with you in this presentation some planting templates, which will also be emailed to you. So don't worry if when I'm sharing these, don't worry about frantically writing everything down. We'll be sharing them with you. But laying out all the plants before you're planting really helps you get your spacing right so that you don't accidentally kind of bunch them all up in a corner. A lot of times native pollinator patches that we're designing are planted at about 15 to 18 inches on center. So we're planting a plant about 15 to 18 inches from the center of one to the center of the next plant. That's pretty dense. That really helps these plants get established and kind of outcompete weeds that might otherwise want to come up. Of course, plant the plant in the soil at the same level that it is in the pot. If you have any big root bound, areas, do cut those apart or kind of cut back the root bound masses to stimulate new root growth. All right, our pocket planting templates. So of course, it's really fun to talk about plants. That's probably what we're all here for. And we're going to show you next a number of different templates for a number of different site conditions so that you can help decide kind of really what would work best for you if this is something you're planning to do next spring. And these are just a few examples of what that might look like on kind of a residential pocket planting type of scale. And you can see they have a big impact. Actually, this planting on the bottom right is a client of ours. We installed this pocket planting and there is meadow blazing star in there. And he said one of the wonderful things about this planting is that all of the neighbors stopped to watch the monarch butterflies feeding on the blazing star, and that it's been such a nice way for them as a community to spend time talking with neighbors. It's a real conversation starter. And so this planting is not only providing forage for pollinators, but it's also kind of bringing a community together. And I think that's a great way for any planting to proceed. It's certainly a really nice thing to hear. So even if you have an area that is small as 75 square feet, that's just 8 feet by 11 feet approximately, then you can have a pollinator planting. So you can see in this picture on the left, we have that's about 8 by 11. Now, of course, this is an oval. You might have part of your yard that's a slightly different shape, and that's fine. You can adapt this template to your needs. I will say the plants in this list prefer a little bit moister soil. So this isn't quite the hot, super dry soil. And the next template that I'll show you is maybe a little bit more suited towards drier soil. So it's important when you look at this template to think about and to look at the plant heights. So the the fifth column over says HT for height. That gives you an idea of how tall these plants are going to get. So if you decide to plant them in an area where the shape is slightly different, you really want the shorter plants around the edges. That's going to help keep anything from flopping into your sidewalk. So if your new planting is like maybe right up against a walkway, planting these shorter species next to the walkway is the way to go. It also tells you the spacing, so how far apart they should be planted, and then their bloom time. And that's really helping you plan out providing that staggered bloom time from spring all the way to fall. So you're really thinking about that as you go through and decide what plants you're interested in. So some of my favorites on this list, of course, include prairie smoke. Prairie smoke is this sort of little salmon colored icon, and it's in the picture on the top left of the photos of the flowers. It blooms early. It's also just really pretty early in the spring when we're all kind of looking to see a little bit of flowers in our yard, and that's a really nice early bloomer. Another kind of great early to mid-season bloomer are golden alexanders, and that's the bright yellow flower. You'll see they're all labeled here at the bottom. The second from the right. Golden alexanders are a pretty tough plant. Now, we plant pollinator plantings in a lot of different areas. Some areas don't get a ton of maintenance, and so having a plant that is going to really be pretty tough and maybe spread a little bit, that's okay. In this case, we really want that to happen because we really want something to get rooted and to get established and to be able to outcompete weeds. And I would say golden alexander falls into that category. It can do some spreading. If that is something you're really worried about it spreading in your yard, then that's probably not the species for you. Of course, we have some swamp milkweed in here. Swamp milkweed is one of the just great milkweed species for monarch butterflies. Purple coneflowers, and then some asters. So in this case, sky blue asters. Some of our asters are some of our latest blooming species in our area. You'll really see pollinators feeding on those up until kind of right about now. Our next template is this full sun garden here. This template is designed to be a little bit bigger. So about 150 square feet is going to be 10 by 15, of course, because this is an oval and not a rectangle. This shows at about 11 by 16. But also what we're trying to help you with these templates are to get an idea of how many plants you might need. So by adapting, by either using one of these templates as it is, or maybe swapping out 1 or 2 plants for some of your favorites, this really gives you an idea of how many you might need to complete a planting of this size. And that's one of the ways we want to kind of help you help make this as easy as possible for you if you're interested in putting in a big pollinator patch. So a couple of my favorites here include, let's see, there's a lot of them. Well, I will say for like sunny, dry conditions, butterfly weed, which is the orange flower, the third from the left, that is a type of milkweed, but it is much more adapted to drier conditions than swamp milkweed, as well as purple prairie clover. Those grow really well together. And we've done some really nice boulevard plantings that include both butterfly weed and purple prairie clover. They can be striking. They tend to bloom around the same time, can be very striking together. And I just think are a really, really nice plant combination, especially for kind of a hot, dry situation. I want to talk a little bit about wild lupin. That's one that I love including in this pollinator planting, but I do find it to be hard to get established. I think as our summers here get a little bit hotter and drier, this one is going to have a little bit more trouble. I think it's really important for you to, when you're purchasing and planting lupin, to make sure you're planting the native lupin. It is the species that will support the Karner blue butterfly, and not a cultivar of lupin, which is very popular. So in this case, you really do need to plant the native species. Rough blazing star is a great blazing star that doesn't get quite as tall as some of the other blazing stars. A really lovely plant. New Jersey tea is great for a hot and dry condition, and I find it to be very, very attractive to pollinators. Also kind of to extend your bloom season, you of course can have Joe Pye weed, sweet Joe Pye weed are both late season bloomers, great for a hot sunny spot. And then I want to talk a little bit about grasses. So we do have little blue stem in this planting. It's really, I think one thing we don't really realize is that pollinators also can use grasses as habitat. And so having things like little blue stem, prairie dropseed, those are all native grasses that existed on our native prairie and that you would find commonly interplanted with a lot of these species. So don't be afraid to also include a lot of native grasses in your designs and in your pollinator plantings, not just flowers, they're also providing habitat. So a little bit about pocket plantings in shade and in rain gardens. So let me just check my time here. All right. Rain gardens are opportunities like the picture on the left where you can maybe capture roof runoff or some other type of runoff and then plant native plants in there to be able to really have their deep roots go deep into the soil to help aid in infiltration. So I've got a couple of planting templates here, both for rain gardens and for shade gardens. So for those of you who have native shade gardens that I was talking about earlier, who still want to support pollinators, here's a great planting template for you. And again, as I mentioned earlier, these are available to you. I'll show you at the end where they're available on our website, and then also I believe they're going to be emailed to all the participants as PDFs so that you can not worry about frantically writing them down today. A couple of the species that I really love in our native shade gardens that just do so well, and I'm kind of focusing on the flowering species because we're talking so much about pollinators, but all of these are some of my favorites. Columbine is a great native plant. It's the picture on the bottom right. It does seed itself around, so we'll move around in your garden. I'm okay with that. I kind of like it when plants find their place and fill in a bit. That works great for me. Also, I really love wild geranium. That is a tough one that can do really well in some drier shade. I think if you have a large tree, you have a lot of shade underneath it. We often call that dry shade, and wild geranium can be a really great one for that spot. Big-leaved aster is really lovely because that's a really late season bloomer for a shade garden. Shade gardens are often, and shade plants are often evolved to kind of have their moment in the spring before a lot of our trees leaf out. That's why so many shade gardens bloom in the springtime, and the rest of the year they have a lot of really interesting texture, but not as much bloom. And so by looking in this list at big-leaved aster and zigzag goldenrod, those are a couple of species, as well as great blue lobelia, that you can pick for later season blooms. So that really helps extend your bloom time in a shady area. Again, if you have a rain garden is going to be inundated by water when it rains, like today, or when it's not raining, it'll be dry. So you have to have some species that are specifically adapted to those types of growing conditions. And this is a really great list here for a rain garden. You can see there's a dashed line in this picture on the left. That really shows you where the side slope is versus the basin. And the plants in the basin need to be able to tolerate that water. The plants on the side slope, less so. That's why you'll see something like butterfly weed, which I mentioned earlier, likes it dry, up on the edges, and I wouldn't necessarily put that in the bottom of a rain garden. So there's a little bit of nuance to this particular planting plan, and so if this is something that you're interested in putting in your garden, then take a look, make sure you're paying attention to which plants are on the side slope and which ones are in the basin. Some are a little bit more adaptable than others. One of the things I really do like in rain gardens is to include some sedges. So this particular planting has fox sedge. Fox sedge does a really great job of holding the soil. Its roots really has kind of a big root mass. It does a really nice job of helping water to infiltrate by creating deep roots. And it greens up really nice in the spring. Spreads out a little bit so that it's not creating a lot of space for weeds to come in. And it's one of the ones I really do like to include in rain gardens, as well as Joe Pyeweed. Joe Pyeweed is an all-around beautiful plant, but does get really tall. So it gets to be about 6 feet tall. If you don't have that space for something that tall, just make sure you're paying attention to that when you're deciding whether to put Joe Pyeweed in your garden. I will say that in the past 2 summers, Joe Pyeweed has suffered a little bit in a few gardens where we've had it. I think because it's been so dry, it really wants to be a bit wetter. And so I have seen it suffer because we've had such dry summers, but it's one of my favorites. So this is just meant to illustrate a little bit about pocket plantings. You don't have to have a huge space to create habitat. You can see pollinators of all shapes and sizes, all kinds of different insects on a ton of different plants that you can create in a really small area. So don't feel like, don't be afraid, don't feel like you don't have enough space to support pollinators. Even having a 5 by 5 or 10 by 10 space makes a really big difference. I just want to touch on boulevard plantings really quickly. We've done a lot of work at Metro Blooms planting boulevards through a project we have with the city of Minneapolis to reestablish habitat in boulevards. Often these boulevards are excavated to be able to capture rainwater runoff to help with stormwater. The picture on the right, we were planting that one in quite a rainfall. I remember that really well. So I want to just talk a little bit about this because I think there are some great opportunities for creating habitat in boulevards, and it can be a difficult growing area. So I have a quick planting template for full sun, which is the picture in the middle. So this is that purple prairie clover and butterfly weed that I mentioned earlier. It's a really nice combination, can be really striking. So this is one of our most popular boulevard planting templates. And this template is really for a full sun condition. You know, boulevards can be a tough growing place. They can often have very compacted soil. So it's really important to decompact the soil before you plant in a boulevard. They often get a lot of salt. They certainly get a lot of foot traffic, pet waste. And so this is kind of the toughest of the tough plants that we have tried in boulevards and are constantly evaluating and improving kind of this template. One of the ones I really like in this is the Pearly Everlasting. It's in the top left. It has a little bit of salt tolerance, and I found that to be pretty important in a lot of our boulevards. I also really like both the Cytotes grama and the Blue grama for grasses in here. They help to provide kind of a matrix of grasses through which the flowers can come up. That's helping to outcompete weeds, hold the soil in what's otherwise a pretty difficult growing spot. So this is a great one for boulevards. All right, now just talking a little bit as I sort of come to the last kind of quarter of this presentation, I want to talk to you a little bit about how to get your new pollinator planting established. One of the things that's really important is how you water it. So after you plant your new planting, it's more important to water for longer, less frequently, rather than 5 minutes every day. The reason you want to do that is that when you water, you want to have that water go deeper into the soil. So we're really encouraging the roots of these native plants, which are generally very deep-rooted plants, really incentivizing them to chase after that water so that the rainwater that the water that you're providing is getting deeper into the soil profile. And then you want to do that less frequently so that it allows it to dry just a little bit. And then when you water again, you water deeply. If you only water for 5 minutes every day, then only the top small layer of soil gets wet, and those roots never grow deep because they're never chasing that water deeper. The deeper the roots get into the soil, the more resilient it'll be in times of drought. So when we have really dry summers, you want those native plants to have established deep roots that are tapping into moisture deeper in the soil profile so that they're not drying out as quickly, and they're more resilient in the case of kind of changing weather patterns that we are experiencing here in Minnesota. So how you water is really important to getting your plants established. Weeding. So one of the things that can be challenging about a new planting is that you have loosened the soil, you have turned the soil over and decompacted it. But what that does do is expose a lot of weed seeds that have been laying dormant in the soil to sunlight and to water, since you're now watering this area for your garden. And you will often see a flush of weeds in the first 1 to 2 seasons after establishing a new garden. That can be very frustrating, but if you weed often, when the weeds are very small, it's much easier to manage. If they get much larger and then they start to flower and go to seed, then you're creating that much more of a weed pressure later on. So I'd say weed often, especially in the first couple of years of establishment, that will really pay off for getting the plants that you want, these native plants, established instead of having it be taken over by weeds. And this is timely right now to talk a little bit about winter garden prep. I was asked to give a presentation recently about how to put your garden to bed for winter. And the message that I really wanted everybody to come away with from that presentation was, well, really don't do very much, actually. Just let it be as much as possible. And there's a few reasons for that. If you leave your plants standing and don't cut them back in the fall, then especially hollow-stemmed plants such as bee balm or cup plant, those plants providing nesting sites for our stem nesting pollinators. So if you leave them standing all winter, they have more habitat. Also, I think they look really nice with snow on them. So from an aesthetic perspective, having big seed heads that goldfinches and other birds can feed on and have snow on them. It's also really lovely to look at, and you can interact with your landscape all winter long. If you do choose to cut your plants back, then leave at least 18 inches remaining, 18 inches from the ground. That will provide enough stem for some of our stem nesting pollinators to be able to overwinter in those stems. If you can, wait until the spring to cut them back. So this way you're leaving them up all winter, they're providing food and habitat. But in the spring, I really want you to wait until soil temperatures reach about 50 degrees. A great way to know when that is when you start seeing dandelions bloom in your area, in people's yards. When you see dandelions blooming, you know that soil temperatures have warmed up to at least 50 degrees and most pollinators have emerged. And then that's fine to go ahead and clean up your garden in the spring. I will say that's a lot later than most of us clean our gardens. I think this past spring was a really beautiful 70-degree day in March, and I saw a lot of people out bagging up their leaves, cleaning up their gardens. And my advice would be to wait. If you really want to support pollinators, they need that leaf litter. And we're going to talk about that next. They need that leaf litter, and some of them are rolled up in there. So they need that to be able to emerge. If you clean it up too early, then you're destroying that pollinator habitat. So relax, take a hike, enjoy the beautiful fall color, and wait until you start to see dandelions blooming in the spring before you start to clean up your garden. Now I get a lot of questions. Okay, well, what about the leaves? What do I do with them? So if I'm not supposed to clean up my garden right now, how am I going to handle all of these leaves? Well, there's a balance there. In the picture on the left, leave the leaves here. That's great. And I think a lot of folks like the Xerces Society, this is from xerces.org, have a great wealth of information about planting for pollinators. And so that's a great resource for you if you're looking to delve a little bit deeper into that. But of course, when we have leaves on our cars, on our driveway, and even in the street, that can be an important place to clean up leaves. So there's a bit of a balance. If you have leaves in the street and they're all going into the storm drain, that can be a water quality issue. So you want to clean up the leaves in the street, but if you have plenty of leaves on your garden beds, great, let them be there. So just think about that balance when you're cleaning up your yard this fall. Great, clean up the street or anything that would go into the storm drain. That's fantastic. But then relax, let your leaves stay on your garden beds. I often rake the leaves from my lawn onto my garden beds so that it helps to insulate the plants if we get a really cold snap before we have any snow. And those leaves provide some insulation, and then they're also providing habitat. So what does that look like? What do I mean when I say that those leaves are providing habitat? Well, a lot of our moths actually roll up in leaves in order to hibernate over the winter. And you can see an example here. I think there's some great social media now about what the importance of leaving your leaves. You know, it says, what's being sent away today? So in all those bags of leaves, there can actually be, a lot of pupa and cocoons of pollinators and moths. So think about leaving your leaves as much as possible. Absolutely clean up your street, but maybe those leaves can go elsewhere in your yard. So as I said, you can rake the leaves from your lawn onto your garden beds. If you decide to mow the leaves on your lawn, you can use a bagging mower to chop those up a little bit and then add that as organic matter to your garden bed. So just one way to kind of recycle all of this great organic matter that we already have available to us. And finally, I want to make sure that I provide you with some resources. So as I mentioned, it's not just planting new habitat that you're creating, but it's also how you're managing that habitat, how you're caring for it, and how you're maintaining it. It's going to go a long way to support pollinators. We have our educational wing, which is Blue Thumb. You can go to bluethumb.org to get more information about we have a free Resilient Yards learning series, we have workshops, and then there's also, in addition to the planting templates that I have provided as part of this presentation, there are even more planting templates under the resources tab on our website as well. There's a lot of really good information there. And then of course, you're welcome to visit metroblooms.org to find out a little bit more about our organization. I really appreciate the Minnesota State Horticultural Society for having me to speak today. And you can always find them at northerngardener.org. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, we have a couple of questions here. And again, just a reminder, you can type your questions in the chat box or the questions box. First question is, what are your suggestions for front yard plantings to make them a little more formal and also no flopping over?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one thing I would say in that case, if you're wanting to put pollinator plantings in your front yard, is to pay a lot of attention to that height, some of the height guidelines. I would definitely plant in groupings. And I like species. So for example, I like both prairie smoke and pussy toes to line front walkways or to be edge species. I also use those in addition to our native prairie onion or nodding onion as edge species because they're fairly neat and they don't tend to flop that much. I will often plant those in groupings of 3 or 4 or larger, kind of right at the corner where of a foundation bed or right at the entrance to a front walkway. And then I'll put some taller species behind them. I like to incorporate clumps of grasses into kind of like a classic residential landscape. I think those can be very neat and orderly and give you that tidy appearance while providing habitat. Prairie dropseed is one of my favorites in that case. I also like some of our bee balms. One of the bee balms that was on one of the templates, but I didn't get a chance to mention, is called Bradbury's Monarda. It can grow in a little bit of shade, and it's also not quite as tall nor as spready as some of as wild bergamot or some other bee balms. It's Monarda bradburyana is the genus and species of that one. So those are just a few to think about for kind of a residential landscape where you want it to look neat and orderly. Make sure that you're really using those low-growing species at the edges, and then planting clumps of prairie onion with some grasses behind them. It's a really nice way to bring in those pollinator species, but then have kind of an orderly look. I would say also, you know, focus on getting maybe 2 spring, 2 summer, and 2 fall species that are blooming in those 3 seasons. So that's one way if you don't want to plant too many different plants, because that might look a little bit messy. If you have maybe 6 different species, so 2 in the spring, 2 in the summer, 2 in the fall, kind of narrow that down to some of your favorites. And that way, plant a little bit more of them so you have a nice, robust garden. And so when it's blooming, it's really robust, but at the same time, by having fewer species, it has a little bit more of a orderly look, but at the same time, ensuring that you're providing blooms throughout the growing season. So that's another idea as well.
Okay, are there any plants not tasty to rabbits?
Oh, that's a great question. If I knew that question, the answer to that, gosh, I feel like, you know, we'd all be we'd all be rich if we could just market plants that don't get eaten by rabbits. They are some of the most difficult things to establishing new habitat, are rabbits. One thing I will say though is that in general, if you let your planting, if you have a lot of rabbit pressure, which is pretty common right now, and you do like fence it for the first 2 growing seasons. So if you have a lot of rabbit pressure and you're like really can't get those plants going because the rabbits are just eating them like crazy, then you do want to probably put some type of fence around it. That can be a chicken wire fence. It doesn't have to be anything permanent. It can be, you know, chicken wire, but the holes need to be small enough that the baby rabbits can't go through. So if you do that for 2 growing seasons, and you encircle it and keep it protected, then in my experience, after 2 growing seasons, the plants are established enough that they can withstand some of that rabbit predation. There is enough, I have a lot of rabbits in my yard, I can't keep them out. But there's enough in my yard that I actually don't notice rabbit damage anymore, and I'm sure they're eating the plants, but the plants are really established. so they're able to withstand that rabbit pressure. I think that in my experience, sometimes the blazing stars, the asters, and the coneflowers get eaten probably the most by rabbits. That's anecdotal because honestly, I have some yards that they'll tell me one plant is eaten, and some yards they'll say, it eats something that I've never heard it rabbit eating before. So it's really hard to determine what's rabbit free. They don't tend to like milkweed, I'll say that, because of the milky sap. So that's a really great plug for milkweed for monarchs. And they don't tend to like the really fragrant ones. So like the prairie onion or nodding onion, they don't eat those very much. And there's one other that I just was, and the New Jersey tea, they don't eat that one a lot either. So just a couple of ideas. But I will say, try to give your new planting some rabbit protection. And if you do that for 2 growing seasons, I think you'll find that you can then take that fencing off and that those plants will be fine. They might get eaten a little bit by rabbits, but they can withstand it at that point. That kind of goes back to my earlier slide about the establishment period being really critical. Just making sure you're helping them get established, and then they can really withstand a lot more.
All right. Are sedges still a good idea given the drought conditions associated with climate change?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think they really are. I've had some great success with sedges. So one of the things that we're really working on is in much larger rain gardens than a small residential scale pocket planting. But if you have a really large rain garden or a really large native planting, interspersing sedges as well as grasses, and then forbs amongst them. So you're really creating what we call a matrix planting. There's a lot of different sedges, and that's also a really important answer to this question, which is just that some sedges can handle drier conditions than others. And so if you feel like this is going to be an area that will stay really dry that you're interested in planting in, then pick a sedge that's going to be more suitable for a dry condition. One that I've used a lot is curly styled wood sedge. It can handle kind of part sun, part shade. That's Carex rosea is the name of that one. Fox sedge does tend to like it a little bit wetter, but that's also a really great, really adaptable species for heavy soils. And the reason that's so nice is those sedges really cover that ground plane. So they cover that soil level. And by providing that coverage, they're helping to outcompete weeds so that weeds don't have this nice open area to be able to take over. So I think those sedges are really, really important. And in one fun way that we've been using them is, as I mentioned before, in a big matrix planting with sedges and grasses and forbs. And that's really adaptable as our climate changes. So we've got a lot of different species in there to be able to handle a really wet or a really dry condition.
All right. I have a lot of weeds in my front yard where I want to put my garden. I tried the lasagna method, but didn't put mulch on top and it went wild underneath. Would the sod kicker help with getting rid of those, or do I pull them by hand? Also, is that something Metro Bloom could help with?
Yeah, those are great questions. So, I mean, I think the sod kicker is pretty effective. Kind of depends on the type of weeds you have. So it has to have something to be able to grab and like cut. If you certainly want to mow your yard before you use a sod kicker. You can't use it on an unmown yard, whether you're mowing weeds or turf grass. I have a lot of different things in my lawn. It's not just turf grass, but I mow it all the same. So you definitely want to mow before using a sod kicker. It can help like loosen it. So even if the sod kicker isn't like pulling all of the weeds up, it can really loosen it to the point where it's easy to just kind of rake up those roots and that plant material to be able to remove it. So that's one way. The lasagna method, you definitely have to have like cardboard, compost or soil, and mulch to really be able to have that be effective. So I would say that's just one. If you decide to try that again, make sure, because otherwise the cardboard can blow away. It's not really like smothering the weeds, which is the point of that method. We do site prep. We do it usually as part of projects that we're designing and installing. So if you're interested in working with Metro Blooms on projects, you can always just go to our website. Actually, I'll flip back One slide, gosh, it's not on there, but it's just metroblooms.org, and you can look at our design services, and it gives you an idea of the type of work we do there if you're interested in looking for that. We do work mostly in the kind of a 30-minute radius around our office here in Minneapolis. I also really like this picture. One thing I just want to note is that you can create a pollinator habitat in containers. So if you don't either have the physical ability to put in a big garden or the space, we are doing a lot of experiments with different types of containers, overwintering plants in containers outside here in Minnesota, which is something we kind of really hadn't been doing for a long time. And we've had some great success with various asters and grasses, overwintering them in containers in Minnesota. So it's also a really nice way to potentially create pollinator habitat in these little tiny pockets, even in a really urban area.
All right, we'll just do one more question, and that is, should you leave your annuals in your beds over winter?
Annuals was the question?
Yes.
Okay. That's really up to you. I have to say I don't do a lot of gardening with annuals. That's just not a design service we tend to provide. I think that's kind of up to you. They won't necessarily provide the type of pollinator habitat that I was mentioning before. So if your point in leaving them is in order to provide pollinator habitat, I don't think they're going to provide that. And if you'd rather clean them up this fall, that's fine. A lot of folks have just like an area of their yard, kind of like a little patch in the front or a patch along the side where they're putting in annuals. And that isn't going to provide quite as much habitat as like the stems and the dead plant material that's above ground, the seed heads of perennials. So I wouldn't apply the same practices to annual beds.
All right. Well, thank you, Jen, and thank you everyone for attending tonight's webinar. After the webinar, you'll receive a survey, and we would really appreciate it if you could complete it and provide your feedback. You will also receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to the recording of tonight's webinar and the PDFs that Jen will provide. You will also get an email with those. And on behalf of the Minnesota State Horticultural Society and our presenter, thank you so much for joining us today, and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jen. Good night.
Bye-bye.